Well, hello and welcome to the first episode of the podcast, Atonement, the Path of Wholeness and Total Integration. So first of all, let me answer the question, what is this podcast? This podcast is a podcast where you will hear real, raw, and relevant conversations about bringing your eternal divinity and manifesting it more fully here on the earth. A lot of our focus here is going to be what I call practical mysticism. Mysticism means understanding the great beyond, the spiritual realities of life, the unseen part of this world, that part of the world that we call spiritual in nature. Where do we come from? Where are we going to? What is this life all about? And the practical side is, it's not just theory, but like, how does this information actually impact our lives? As men, how does it result in us being financially abundant? How does it relate to our relationships with our spouses, to having more frequent and better sex? These are the kind of conversations that we're going to be having here, the kind of conversations that most human beings are not just terrified to talk about, but actually even terrified to listen about. Because ultimately what happens when we begin to reveal our truth, when we begin to really dig deep into the parts of our lives that aren't working, is we begin to feel exposed. And then in this exposure, we begin to feel inadequate. And in this inadequacy, we begin to be face to face with our own sense of shame and guilt, that somehow there's something wrong with us, that somehow we're not enough, that somehow we're not measuring up, that somehow we're not pleasing some angry God in heaven. My name is Enoch Sears, and I'm your host on this podcast. On this podcast, we'll be doing interviews. I'll be sharing specific content, and everything's going to be focused on helping you live not a life of mediocrity, not a life of detached sedation, but a life of aliveness, a life that you can look back on your deathbed and know that you've given it your all. Every solution, every good thing in life comes as a solution to a problem. Henry Ford developed the Model T because he saw a need for an affordable automobile so that people didn't need to travel in carriages. Thomas Edison developed a light bulb because he saw the inefficiencies of using kerosene lamps and gas to provide light. And so as we enter into this conversation here on this podcast, we maybe ask ourselves the question, what are the problems that this podcast is meant to address? The problems that you may be experiencing, the problems that I've experienced in my life. So first of all, before we get into that, let's jump into why the title of the podcast, Atonement, the Path of Wholeness and Total Integration. Is this some atonement? The word atonement is typically a word used in a Christian context referring to the reconciliation that Jesus Christ performed in paying for the sins of humanity. And certainly we're going to touch on that meaning of it. But what I'd have you consider is that the story of the atonement of Jesus Christ, of the Son of God giving his life to pay for our sins, at its very core, has a deeper meaning. And I know I've had friends and people often ask me, and I've asked myself, why in the world, it doesn't make sense. Why would a God in heaven, why would an angry God, why would a God make his perfect and innocent Son suffer to pay for our misdeeds? Sounds rather vindictive, sounds rather odd, doesn't make sense. Why can't God just accept us back into his presence and just forgive us if we have contrite hearts? Why does someone need to die or suffer because of our misdeeds, because of our sins, because of our turning away from God? And that is going to be a question that we will be addressing and touching upon in many different ways here on the podcast. But what I'd have you consider is that more important to you and I than the theoretical question, and maybe let me rephrase, instead of saying more important, more relevant to you and I than the philosophical or theoretical reasons for Jesus' atonement are, what does the atonement mean to you and I? What is this strange word and how does it apply to our lives individually? And what does it have to do with you as a man having more and more frequent sex and more satisfying sex with your wife? You succeeding financially, you having a massive impact on the world, you being the paragon and example for your children that they can look up to, that they want to emulate. You being the king that your wife adores, that your wife worships, and her being the queen that you adore and that you worship. How does this word atonement, how does this principle of atonement apply to these two things? And what are the practical, real-world results about why in the hell this should matter to you? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about on this podcast. And as I mentioned, if you haven't picked up already, yes, we are going to be talking about subjects and topics that in religious circles are often not talked about or talked about quietly in hushed tones, that are talked about in embarrassed overtones. Yeah, we're going to be talking very directly about sex and marriage. We're going to have guests on here. I'm going to share my experience. We're going to talk about how sex goes beyond just the physical fulfillment between a man and a woman, beyond just the need to create, but how it is one of the most powerful life-giving and energy-giving faculties that you have as a divine soul on this earth. We're going to talk about economic production, about money, about what it takes to be a successful business person in today's world, about what it takes to have impact and leadership, to be the kind of man who can be counted on, the kind of man who delivers results, the kind of man who can be trusted, the kind of man who represents the whole person that Jesus Christ gave us the example that we can be. And we'll do this through a frame not of self-righteousness, not of a holier-than-thou approach, but we're going to have a look at these things as they really apply to you and I. So let's look at the word atonement. The word atonement, if you didn't know, comes from Middle English, and scholars say that it means in harmony. It means in harmony. So just consider this, that the very idea of harmony necessitates the need of two things that could be seen as opposing. In the world of philosophy, this is called dualism. And Lehi talks about this in Nephi chapter 2. Where he says there must needs be opposition in all things. The basic idea here is that for you to be able to experience sweet, you need to understand what the bitter tastes like. For you to experience light, the only way that you experience light is by experiencing darkness. The only way you experience pleasure is in contrast. This is the nature of duality. This is the nature of this physical realm in which we live. Because in this physical realm, this worldly plane in which we exist, there's me, what we perceive as there's me, and there's you. I'm sitting here in front of this microphone right now. I'm saying, okay, I look at this microphone. This microphone seems to be a different object than me. I perceive myself being here. I perceive my microphone being there. This is the idea of separation and duality. So the very word atonement has at its core the idea behind it that there are two separate things. And atonement is about bringing these things into harmony, bringing them together. Now, if we look up the word harmony, we can see what does harmony actually mean. According to Oxford Languages Dictionary here on Google, harmony has a number of different definitions. And I like the first one because it's musical. It talks about the combination of simultaneously sounded musical notes together to produce chords and chord progressions having a pleasing effect. So isn't that interesting? Harmony is when you overlap these different musical notes together to get something that's greater than the individual parts. Another definition is the quality of forming a pleasing and consistent whole. So think about this for a second. Your life is made of dualities. What does that mean? Your life is made of different things, separation. There's you and your wife. This is a great example. Or if you're a woman, this may be your wife and maybe you and your husband, right? But in a couple, in a marriage where there's male and female, what we have is we have a man and a woman. We have two partners. Separation. And so harmony is when these two come together and they form a pleasing and consistent whole. We read in the Bible, the writings of Paul talks about a man and a woman when they come together being one flesh. The Bible talks about this idea of when two people get married, they come together, they make this covenant, this promise, this commitment, and they come together to be one flesh. There's another definition of harmony here, talking about the New Testament. It says, an arrangement of the four Gospels or of any parallel narratives which present a single continuous narrative text. So I want you to consider that the idea of atonement is the rebalancing of the duality of reality. So the fact that we need to experience pain and pleasure, the fact that we need to experience sugar and bitterness, the fact that we need to experience light and dark, the fact that darkness needs to exist for light to exist, the fact that fear needs to exist for love to exist. The idea of the atonement is bringing these things together and having them operate in harmony. Now, you better believe this applies to you in your life, because everywhere in your life you will be blessed and you will benefit from harmony. If you're leading business teams, if you're in a position of authority in a business, maybe you run sales teams, maybe you're like me, you're a business owner, you have people on your team. A team that does not have atonement is a team that's pulling in all different directions. There's no harmony. There's no communication. There's resentment. There's bitterness. There's backbiting. There is striving for promotions. There is brown-nosing, right? There is laziness. There are people not pulling their weight. This is what happens when we have an inefficient team. When we have an efficient team, everyone pulls their weight together. One person isn't pulling more of their fair share of the load. And what happens in teams, when everyone's working together in harmony, is that the output of that team is much, much greater than the different and disparate and separate pieces individually. So, in other words, if you have a team of 10 people and they're each working individually, they're not cooperating, they're not working in harmony, they're all doing their own thing, you'll get a certain result. But that result will be greater if those 10 people operate in harmony. So I want you to consider that this is one of the meanings of the word atonement, and this points to what Jesus accomplished, what Jesus showed us, what the atonement means in a spiritual and philosophical sense, but also what applies to each of us individually within our own souls. You see, because here's the thing. For the first 40 years of my life, I lived my life trying to escape what I thought were the dark parts of me. For instance, as a young child, I would be sad. I would cry. And you know what the adults around me told me? They told me, Enoch, don't be sad. Don't cry. And although they were well-intentioned, the way that I took this instruction, this training, was that there was something wrong with being sad. There was something wrong with crying. There was something wrong with showing my negative so-called emotions. And I would go to church, and at church I would listen to songs like, if you see a frowny face, do not let it stay. Turn that frown upside down and smile that frown away. And so I trusted what the adults around me were telling me. I thought that, hey, this is the way to live a powerful life, is to not have these negative thoughts and feelings, not to have these negative emotions, and not to be sad, not to grieve, or if I did grieve, or if I was sad, to hide it away and not to let anyone see it. If I was feeling like I had a frowny face, just wipe that frowny face away and have a smiley face. Sadly, this approach is the opposite of atonement. This is the opposite of at-one-ment. Atonement, as we're going to be talking about it here on the podcast, for bringing more of your manifest divinity into your life, into your relationship with your wife, into the relationship with your children, into your business relationship, into your career success. It's not about denying these flawed and maybe even people might say negative parts of our humanity. It's about integrating them. It's about bringing them back to the table. It's about listening to them and seeing what they have to teach us not trying to pretend we don't have them, not trying to completely eradicate them from our life. I was attending a seminar years ago, and the seminar leader that was leading the transformational breakthrough that we were experiencing said a quote that Carly's my wife, that we often talk about and laugh about, that what you resist persists. What you resist persists. And we see this. We see this today. We see the of men today. We see men who don't know how to integrate their sexuality, men who are scared and afraid of their own sexuality. And so we see sexuality in society today being expressed in dark and unhelpful ways. We see sexual expression happening through control, through manipulation, through one-night stands, through things that are very devoid and detached from real heart, from real soul. And as humanity, what's our response to these things? Is to demonize this aspect of humanity, to try to hide it, to try to sweep it under the rug, to try to pretend like it doesn't exist. Dr. Robert Glover wrote a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy. And in this book, he has a magnificent quote. And he says that he's a therapist. He's a man that does a lot of men's work. And here's what he said based upon his experience. He said, I have developed a theory that states the nicer the guy, the darker the sexual secrets. He says, I find this to be consistently true. Sex is a basic human drive. Nice guys, most quote-unquote nice guys, this is from his book, believe that they're bad for being sexual or believe that other people will think they are bad. Sexual impulses have to be kept hidden from view. And I want you to think about, imagine when you were a kid and you had these little water balloons, right? Do you remember those little tiny water balloons that we'd get on the playground on the hot day and we'd throw them at each other and we'd just have a blast as kids? And did you ever try squeezing one of those? If it wasn't too full, you would squeeze on it, and then guess what? That water balloon would like bulge out in one area, and then you'd squeeze on there and it'd bulge out in another, and you squeeze that area, it's bulge out in another area. Like, this is fun. It was fun to play with this, right? That is like what happens when we try to repress our sexual drive as men. Now, on this podcast, I'm going to be speaking largely from a man's perspective. We're going to have a lot of women on here as guests. We're going to be talking about the divine masculine. We're going to be talking about the divine feminine. We're going to be talking about the relationship and the dynamic between male and female. And primarily what we'll be touching upon here, we won't be dealing with a lot of transgender issues or homosexuality or homosexual marriages. We're going to come with the frame of a cisgendered man, white male, that's me, because that's from my experience. So typically on this podcast, I will be talking about marriage between a man and a woman. I'll be talking about the masculine polarity, the feminine polarity, and I'll use these things interchangeably. But the point is, when this sexual drive, this normal human drive is repressed, when we attach shame to it, when we're embarrassed, when there's any hesitancy of embarrassment about this shame, what ends up happening is it opens up the avenue for unhealthy expression of this sexuality. And so we see terrible things happening and human beings doing terrible things to each other. Rape, pillage, incest, molestation, sexual abuse, physical violence happening between men and women. And what I'd have you consider is that these things are symptoms of disintegration. Atonement is integration. Chaos is disintegration. Unhealthy patterns is disintegration. So consider that the word atonement, as it pertains to you, as it pertains to me, is about us harmonizing within ourselves all of the competing forces. I know as a man, as a human being, I have a lot of competing forces within me. I have sexual drive. I have the need to sleep. Sometimes these two forces are competing against each other. I have sexual drive. I also have the desire to love other people, to love my wife, to not manipulate her. And so these two things need to be integrated. Because what a man does when he's unintegrated, when he's not integrated, when he's unconscious, when he's acting out his sexuality unconsciously, which happens in marriages all the time, is his wife can feel like, one of my female friends once told me, a pincushion. She can feel like she is just a receptacle for vaginal masturbation. And you may laugh because you may know that as a man you've done that. I know that I've certainly done that with my wife as well. Just viewed her as something, as an object to satisfy this human desire, this human drive that I have of sexuality. So if you're experiencing this and you know what I'm talking about, like these are the kind of real conversations we're going to have here. And what I want to invite you into is a conversation around these things that is devoid of shame, that is devoid of guilt, that is devoid of judgment. I was listening to one of the things that I really like to do is I like to listen to near-death experiences. They give me a lot of hope for what death is about and really a lot of lack of fear of death. And there's some remarkable experiences. And if you listen to them, what you'll find is that there's just these commonalities in these near-death experiences. But one of them that comes to mind right now is kind of a funny story because it deals with this idea of sexuality. It's this guy talking about how he died. He went to the afterlife, and Jesus appeared to him, right? So Jesus appears to him, and he recognizes Jesus, even though he wasn't necessarily a religious guy. And as he's sitting there talking with Jesus, he suddenly gets very embarrassed. And Jesus has a smile on his face, and the man says that he tells Jesus, "I'm embarrassed because I thought about something that I like, and I thought about boobs." And I love what he recounts in this near-death experience. He said, Jesus just laughed. Jesus just laughed, right? The cool thing is, like, Jesus was a human being, right? Jesus walked on the earth. Jesus knows what it's like to be a man. Jesus knows that most guys like boobs. Like, this is no secret. And the interesting thing, and the reason why I bring this up is because we don't need to be ashamed about this. This will be a place here on this podcast where we're not going to be ashamed about our humanity. We're not going to be embarrassed about what God has created us to be. Because God created us to have these desires. God created us, biology, whichever way you look at it, we are created with these sexual desires. We're created with these things like frustrations, irritations, anger, resentment, jealousies. Like, these are natural parts of being a human being. But when we try to push these things away from us out of fear, out of shame, or out of guilt, they end up digging their tentacles into us even more powerfully. So the path of atonement, the path of wholeness, refers not only to the reconciliation that Jesus Christ did on the grand universal cosmic level, and we'll talk plenty more about that on this podcast, but consider that it has to do with your own personal atonement, with you atoning, with you integrating, with you harmonizing these competing forces within yourself, and that your ability to be to be a fully alive, and to be a man who gets stuff done in the world, a man who be counted on, a man who stands as a king for his family, your divinity will be accelerated as you're able to harness these powers of sexuality, these powers of anger, these powers of frustration, these powers of irritation, the desire to win, the desire to compete. Like, these things are not to be cut out of your life. They're not to be gotten rid of. They're meant to be metabolized. They're meant to be used. They're meant to be channeled for your production as a man, as a leader, as a divine soul on this earth. And I want you to consider that you and I, we incarnated here. We came here. Our souls descended here, partially because we were intrigued by the idea of a body. We were intrigued by the ability to come, take that divine essence that we are, incarnate it into these physical bodies, and use them as tools of co-creation with God. The problem facing much of Latter-day Saint culture today, much of Christian culture today, many faith traditions today is that these faith traditions have become something that demonize the human aspects of life. They become something where they try to paint this perfect picture about what a human being should be. And we need look no farther than the sex scandals in the Catholic Church for the priests abusing young boys to see that that is not healthy. It's not healthy to repress human sexuality. It's not healthy to live as a disintegrated person. And so I want you to consider that whatever area in your life is not working now, that if we were to peel it back and if we were to look at the root causes of why this thing is not working for you, at its core, there is a disintegration. There's something that needs to be harmonized. There's something that needs to be integrated. Whether you feel stuck in your career right now, maybe you're in financial lack right now. Maybe you're waking up as a middle-aged man and wondering, how did I get here? I thought that I would be so much farther ahead. Or maybe you're dealing with children who are making choices that disappoint you and you're wondering, how did I get here? Or maybe you're looking at the relationship you could have had with your kids, but you pour yourself into the work, you weren't there for them. And so that relationship doesn't exist and you have regrets about how you showed up for your children. Maybe you find yourself in a sexless marriage and it's been going on for so long, you've given up the hope of ever connecting sexually. And like many men, maybe you've decided to sedate that because, let's face it, that sexual power needs expression. And so you masturbate sadly in the shower and you resign yourself to that's just what your life is about. Or maybe you completely shut your sexuality off altogether because your wife isn't sexually available. And so this is what we do. We give up. We give up the dream. We stop being honest about what we want in life. We resign ourselves to a booby prize instead of going after all that life has to offer. So if there's one thing that I want this podcast to inspire in you, it is to awaken you to the possibility of what your life could be like. And you see, one of the biggest challenges for us, when I say us, I mean people living in a developed nation, middle-class people who have everything going pretty well, education, married, got a family, going to kids' soccer games, like life is working out pretty well. Maybe you're volunteering with the scout troop, serving in your church callings, like life's going okay. I want you to consider that the biggest challenge that you will have as you step into more and more abundance is the curse of comfort, is the curse of getting so comfortable that you stop striving. Because what I know is in my life when I've been under severe compression, when things have not been going well, when I've been under extreme pain, when I've been under extreme circumstances that has tested my mettle, when I've looked and I've thought, I don't know where I'm going. I feel like giving up. I don't know what to do. It was these times that I pushed myself even harder, that I came through with resolve that I did not know that I had. And it was the pain. So you see, Christianity and this idea of finding some eternal heaven where everyone is in bliss and peace is missing half of the puzzle. It's not about denying our humanity. It's about integrating our humanity. It's not about living in a heaven where there's no pain. It's about having a heaven even though there is pain. It's not about trying to do the right thing, trying to achieve some impossible idea of perfection by doing the right thing. It's about surrendering our heart to what's needed in the moment and being led moment by the inner voice that feels like it comes somewhere around this heart. What I will say today is that now more than ever, our world needs men who are switched on to their divinity. Our world needs men who are waking up and not falling deeper and deeper into sleep. Men who are rising up as leaders in their families, not through coercion or manipulation, but through servant leadership. Not abdicating the throne to their wife because their wife is the organized one, and now their wife is trying to not only manage the household, but also manage the kids, but also manage the spiritual growth of the family, also manage the vacations, also prepare for the vacations, and leaving no time for herself. Now, I know that we as men, we try to do the best we can with our sweethearts, with our queens. We try to provide the support that we feel like she needs. But it's hard. It's hard. At times, our wives don't ask for help. They're so, at least my wife, she's so proficient at what she does. Oftentimes, she won't even reach out for help and support until the load is so heavy that she's almost about to snap. But I'd have you consider that as men, we need to be aware of this before it gets to the breaking point. Because this is what causes divorces. This is what causes sexless marriages. This is what causes disconnection. This is what causes men to be and feel alone, to feel like there's this hole in their heart that they can never fill. No matter how much they pour themselves into their work, no matter how many awards they get, no matter how much financial resources they rack up, no matter how many athletic events they're able to achieve and to crush, no matter how many church callings and home teaching visits, ministering visits they go on, no matter how much they read their scriptures, no matter how much they fast, no matter how much they pray, they still have this hole in their heart, their soul speaking to them and telling them that there's something more. There's something more available for you. There's something more available for me. We live in a day today when the media would have us believe that humanity is headed to hell in a handbasket. What I would have you consider is that this is a false narrative. That there are people today who are waking up to their divinity more than ever before. We have people who are more switched on than ever before. And so what I see is I see a diversion. I see a fork in the road. I see that, yes, some minority elements of humanity are still propagating the old patterns of greed, of lust, of exploitation, of control. But there's a whole nother segment of humanity that is rising up into their divinity, that is waking up into their spiritual capacity as human beings, as fathers, as mothers, as community members, as business leaders. And if you're listening to this podcast, maybe you've heard the call to. Maybe you know that there's something in your soul that says that you're destined for something greater than you actually have even imagined for yourself. That you know that you're meant to be a beacon of light. That you know that you're on this earth at this time because you have very particular talents that you haven't even dug into yet. That you have yet to stretch the full capacity of your humanity and your divinity. So this podcast is primarily a call and an invitation for Christian men and Latter-day Saint men particularly to wake up. To wake up to your greatness. To wake up to the areas in which you were asleep. To wake up and get honest about the areas in your life that aren't working. Instead of feeling lonely, feeling alone, feeling like there's no way out, feeling like you're trapped, feeling like you need to settle for the hand that you've been dealt. Understanding that you are not alone. That the majority of marriages out there are sadly unfulfilled. That the majority of men in marriages feel alone in the relationship where they should feel most desired, where they should feel most loved, where they should feel most appreciated. They feel underappreciated. They feel like no matter what they do, they're never enough. And so, again, they put on the nice guy smile, and they try to be their best self, and they try to let it go by wander under the bridge, but at the same time, it's themselves they're selling under the bridge. It's themselves that is flowing in that river away from themselves as they live a disintegrated life, a life without atonement. They go to church, they take the sacrament, they participate in the temple, and they think that they are atoned. But they're missing the point. They're missing the point that atonement is not something you do on the outside. Atonement is a shift of something that happens on the inside. And the things that happen on the outside, the ordinances, the rituals, the service, all of these things are simply manifestations of an inner transformation. And the sad part is that these things can be done for an entire lifetime without ever having experienced that inner transformation. This podcast is about bringing together the spiritual life with the worldly life, bringing together not only spiritual attainment in your realization, your spiritual progression, but also bringing forth financial production on this earthly plane. Because if your religion isn't good enough to be able to bring you financial wealth, if you're not for itself, but as an expression of your divinity, not through lust, not through greed, but again, as an expression of your co-creation with God. If your religion isn't enough to help you have a radically turned on relationship with your queen, with your so-called eternal companion, then I would just invite you to consider that, like me, you had never been taught the truth that lies behind your religion. So with that, I'm going to wrap the episode today. We've talked about a number of things. We've talked about how the media would have you believe that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and how this is not true. How the world right now needs men like you to stand up in your divinity. It needs men like you to lead your family powerfully. It needs men like you to lead your business teams in a powerful way, in a Christ-centered, in a Christ-conscious way. And that this Christ-centered and Christ-conscious way is not the disintegrated way that has been shoved down your throat by cultural Mormonism, by cultural Christianity, but that there's an integrated version that you know because you've seen it. You know what I'm talking about. And you know there's something wrong with the way that religious men and women try to paint a one-sided version of what it means to be a human being. There's a part of you that recognizes that your darkness is the key to your power. There's a part of you that recognizes that your integration is what is going to allow you to stand with confidence, naked in front of God, men, and witnesses, and say, "Here I am, Lord. Send me." Now, the invitation as we end up this episode is to head on over to iTunes and leave an honest review. If you've hated this, give it 1 star and say, "That was a terrible podcast." If you loved it, head over there and give it 5 stars and say, "This is amazing. Can't wait to hear second episode." We're going to be releasing an episode every single week. And in addition, you can head over to enochsears.com and you can sign up for the newsletter. Just put your email in there and then I'll notify you when we have new podcast episodes. You'll be part of the conversation as I share more about my own personal journey, the journey I've gone through, walking through being a disintegrated man, being a man who is sedated, being a man who is completely separate from myself, being a man who, although I went through all the steps that I was taught, still ended up feeling alone and lost. This is the journey I'll be sharing with you, how I've gone from that guy to being a guy who is confident in who he is as a human being. Not because of some special attribute, but because I am fearless when it comes to exposing myself. I am not afraid to let people know what is true for me. And this is the permission that I want to give you to start to be honest in your life with the people around you. Honest with your wife about what you really want. Honest with your employer about what you really think about your workplace. Honest with your fellow colleagues at work about what you think about them. Honest with your team members about what you think about them. Honest with yourself about what you really want in life. So with that, it's a wrap. Head over to enochsears.com for more. And as always, carpe diem and goodbye for now.